June 4th, 1942. The Pacific Ocean stretches endlessly under the rising sun, waves glistening like polished steel. It is the morning of a battle that will decide the fate of empires, a clash where courage, timing, and luck will weigh more heavily than brute strength. Japan, fresh from 6 months of triumph after Pearl Harbor, has unleashed its mighty Kido Butai, the most powerful carrier force the world has ever seen, against the small atoll of Midway, a speck of coral in the middle of nowhere. The Japanese believe their plan is flawless: lure the weakened American fleet into a trap, crush it, and cement dominance over the Pacific. 4 of their finest fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, stand ready, bristling with aircraft. Symbols of a war machine that had never known defeat at sea, yet across the ocean, hidden beneath layers of silence and secrecy, American cryptographers have cracked the Japanese code. Admiral Chester Nimitz knows where the enemy will strike. Instead of walking into an ambush, the Americans will lie in wait. Outnumbered, with only 3 fleet carriers of their own, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, they prepare for a desperate gamble. The outcome is uncertain, the risks enormous, but the stakes are nothing less than the survival of the Pacific Fleet and America's chance to turn the tide of war. What unfolds over the next 3 days will shock the world. By sunset, Japan's pride, the 4 carriers that brought devastation at Pearl Harbor, will lie broken and burning, victims of a stunning reversal. The laughter of early victory will fade into silence, replaced by the sobering truth. At Midway, the hunter became the hunted, and history itself was rewritten. The dawn of June 4th, 1942, was deceptively quiet over Midway Atoll. A fragile peace lingered in the air as seabirds wheeled above the turquoise waters and Marines on the ground scanned the horizon, uneasy but resolute. Midway itself was no grand fortress, just 2 small islands, Sand and Eastern, with runways scraped into the coral and a scattering of anti-aircraft guns. Yet these 2 dots in the vast Pacific were about to become the center of the world's greatest naval gamble. For Japan, Midway was supposed to be the bait, the lure that would draw out America's remaining carriers into open waters where they could be destroyed. For the United States, Midway was a trap already sprung, a stage carefully prepared through the brilliance of codebreakers who had uncovered Japan's intentions weeks before. The Japanese arrived with overwhelming strength. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, commanded the operation from afar, convinced that the Americans, still reeling from December's humiliation, could not stand against his Kido Butai. Leading the striking force was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, with his 4 great carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, veterans of every victory since the war began. Each ship bristled with aircraft, agile Zero fighters, deadly Val dive bombers, and Kate torpedo planes, the same that had ripped battleships apart at Pearl Harbor. Japan's confidence was absolute. They believed the Americans would stumble blindly into their waiting jaws, but Yamamoto's plan, grand as it was, rested on fragile assumptions. He believed his codes were unbreakable. He believed the Americans were too cautious to risk what little strength they had left. He believed surprise remained his greatest weapon. What he did not believe, what he could not imagine, was that somewhere in a nondescript building in Pearl Harbor, a team of American cryptographers had already peeled back the veil. Through tireless effort, they had discovered that the target codenamed AF was Midway. By sending a false message that Midway's water plant had failed and watching the Japanese transmit AF short of water, the Americans confirmed their suspicions. Now, instead of waiting helplessly, Admiral Nimitz positioned his carriers in the seas northeast of Midway, ready to strike before Japan even realized the trap was set. Still, even with foreknowledge, the American position was precarious. Their fleet was battered, their pilots far less experienced than Japan's veterans. The carrier Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea only weeks earlier. Yet in a feat of engineering miracles, repair crews worked around the clock. patching her wounds in just 3 days before sending her back to sea. Enterprise and Hornet sailed alongside, carrying men who knew the odds, but also knew that if they failed here, the road to Hawaii, and perhaps even the American West Coast, would be wide open. Courage and desperation were their companions as they entered the theater of fate. At 4:30 a.m., Nagumo's first wave lifted from the decks of his carriers. Over 100 planes roared into the sky, bound for Midway itself. The island's defenders braced as the Japanese bombers descended, explosions shattering runways and setting fuel stores ablaze. Smoke filled the sky, yet Midway's garrison fought back fiercely. American marine fighters scrambled to meet the enemy, though their aircraft, outdated Buffaloes and Wildcats, were torn apart by the superior Zeros. Losses were heavy, but the defenders bought precious time, and most importantly, they sent out a message. The enemy carriers had revealed their presence. The battle was now joined. As the skies over Midway burned, Nagumo faced his first critical decision. His planes had damaged the atoll, but not destroyed its defenses. A second strike was required to finish the job. But then came news that American ships had been sighted nearby. Should he rearm his planes for another strike on Midway, or switch their loadouts to anti-ship weapons? Nagumo hesitated, choosing to wait until his first wave returned. In those tense minutes, fate hung by a thread. Below deck, crews scrambled to change bombs and torpedoes. The hangars of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu filled with fuel lines, munitions, and chaos, a disaster waiting for a spark. Meanwhile, the Americans were already in motion. Midway's remaining bombers, including lumbering B-26s and antiquated Vindicators, launched desperate attacks against the Japanese carriers. They were met with slaughter. Nearly every plane was shot from the sky, their pilots consumed in flames or swallowed by the ocean. Yet their sacrifices served a purpose. They kept the Japanese fighter cover occupied, forcing the Zeros lower, scattering them in pursuit of each ragged assault. Each failed attack was another strand in the web of destiny, thinning Nagumo's defenses, exhausting his pilots, and buying time for the strike that was yet to come. It was then, high above the clouds, that the hammer fell. From the northeast, American dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown arrived at the perfect moment, guided not by flawless planning, but by a convergence of chance, determination, and instinct. They had been lost, searching aimlessly, nearly turning back, until Squadron Commander Wade McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing through the waves. He followed it, gambling it would lead him back to the fleet. It did. At 10:22 a.m. the skies opened, and the dive bombers rolled into their deadly descent. The carriers, Akagi, Kaga and Soryu, with decks cluttered by fueled planes and armed bombs, were caught completely off guard. Sirens wailed, anti-aircraft guns spat furiously into the sky, but it was too late. One after another, bombs slammed into their decks, ripping through steel and igniting catastrophic fires. The Japanese fleet, once so invincible, was engulfed in explosions. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's great carriers were mortally wounded, their crews fighting desperately as infernos consumed them. For the men watching from the skies, it was a vision of apocalyptic fury. Entire ships transformed into blazing pyres, warriors leaping into the sea to escape the flames. The shock was beyond measure. In one devastating strike, the heart of Japan's naval air power had been gutted. Nagumo's command was in chaos, Yamamoto's grand plan unraveling before his eyes, though hundreds of miles away. Yet amid the smoke and ruin, one carrier, Hiryu, remained, and her warriors would soon strike back with fury. The battle was not yet over, and the cost to the Americans was still to come. The ocean seemed to hold its breath after the inferno. 3 of Japan's proudest carriers, Akagi, Kaga and Soryu, were crippled in the span of minutes, the pride of the Kido Butai now reduced to burning hulks. Smoke boiled into the heavens, black columns that stretched miles into the sky. Survivors clung to wreckage or leapt into the sea, their cries swallowed by the roar of flames. For the Japanese sailors, who had known nothing but victory since December 7th, the sight was unimaginable. They had been the hunters at Pearl Harbor, the avengers at the Coral Sea, the masters of the Pacific. Now, in a moment of cruel reversal, they were prey, helpless beneath the vengeance of American dive bombers. But the battle was not finished. Amid the wreckage, one ship remained undamaged. Hiryu, sleek and defiant, she had escaped the first assault, her decks clear and her flight crews ready. From her hangars, the counterblow would come. Vice Admiral Yamaguchi Tamon, commanding Hiryu, understood the enormity of the moment. With 3 carriers lost, the weight of the Empire's honor fell upon his shoulders. He did not hesitate. Within minutes, he launched a strike of dive bombers aimed at the nearest American carrier, Yorktown. The men of Yorktown had just tasted triumph. Their planes had joined in the assault that crippled the Japanese giants, and sailors on deck watched the distant columns of smoke with awe. Yet they knew victory in war was never secure. Radar screens lit up. Enemy aircraft inbound. The alarm klaxon wailed, and the crew scrambled to battle stations. Anti-aircraft gunners swung their weapons skyward, the ship bristling with defiance. At 12:20 p.m., Hiryu's bombers descended. From the clear blue, they came screaming downward, their shadows racing across the waves. Flak filled the air, a storm of steel, but the Japanese pilots pressed on, diving with precision honed by years of training. Bombs struck the Yorktown amidships, tearing through her flight deck, shattering bulkheads and igniting fuel fires that raced through her corridors. The ship shuddered as explosions ripped her open. Smoke poured into the sky as sailors fought to contain the inferno, dragging hoses through flames, sealing off compartments, and sacrificing themselves to keep the carrier afloat. By rights, she should have been lost. But the Yorktown's crew refused to surrender their ship. Damage control teams, hardened by their desperate repairs weeks earlier, fought with astonishing determination. Within an hour, the fires were under control. Blackened, battered, her decks scarred and buckling, Yorktown still stood proud. And then, incredibly, she recovered. By 2:30 p.m., her flight deck was clear enough for aircraft to resume operations. The carrier that had been struck down rose again, defying her enemy, refusing to die. The Japanese could not believe it. From Hiryu's decks, Yamaguchi prepared another strike. If the first wave had failed to finish the job, the second would. This time, torpedo planes were armed, sleek Kates loaded with their deadly cargo. They launched in disciplined waves, weaving low across the water. American Wildcats rose to intercept, but the Zeros, escorting the Kates, tore into them, clearing a path. At 3:30 p.m., the torpedo planes bore down on Yorktown. Again, the anti-aircraft guns thundered. Again, the ship twisted and turned, her captain maneuvering with desperate skill. But the attackers pressed in, braving fire so thick the air itself seemed aflame. 2 torpedoes slammed into Yorktown's side, the impact lifting the giant vessel as if struck by a hammer. Bulkheads collapsed, power failed, and water rushed in with terrifying force. The carrier shuddered to a halt, listing heavily. Her engines went silent, her lights flickered out. This time the damage was too great. As her crew abandoned ship, Yorktown drifted, wounded beyond saving. She would later sink, claimed by the relentless sea. For a moment the tide seemed to shift again. The Americans had struck a mortal blow to Japan, but at a terrible cost. The loss of Yorktown was a wound the U.S. Navy could scarcely afford. Yet the sacrifice was not in vain. While Hiryu's planes had taken their revenge, they had revealed her position. American scouts now marked her coordinates. The hunters had shown their hand, and retribution was on its way. Even as Yorktown smoldered, dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet took to the skies once more, their fuel tanks filled, their bombs slung beneath their wings. They knew what awaited them, the last of Japan's carriers, isolated and vulnerable. Pilots whispered silent prayers, tightened their grips on throttles, and flew into the fading light of afternoon, seeking the final act of the day's drama. The fate of the Pacific now hinged on whether they could deliver one more decisive strike before darkness fell. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the Pacific on June 4th, 1942, the battle had become a brutal exchange of hammer and anvil. The Americans had delivered their staggering morning blow, reducing 3 of Japan's fleet carriers to blazing wrecks. Yet Japan had answered with fury, and the Yorktown, bloodied, crippled, and ultimately abandoned, had paid the price. The seas between Midway and the open ocean now bore witness to burning steel, shattered aircraft, and countless men fighting for their lives in the water. And still one great question lingered. Could the last surviving Japanese carrier, Hiryu, turn the tide? From her decks, Admiral Yamaguchi remained resolute. His men had already launched 2 punishing strikes, and their aim had been true. He knew the odds, knew his fleet was crippled beyond repair, yet he also understood the code of the warrior. If Japan was to fall at Midway, it would not fall without honor. But fate was closing in. Far to the east, squadrons from the Enterprise and Hornet droned through the skies, carrying with them the weight of America's desperate hope. Their mission was simple, brutal, and absolute. Find Hiryu and finish her. The search was not easy. Clouds cloaked the horizon, and time pressed heavily as daylight waned. Yet fortune once again guided the Americans. At last the carrier was sighted, a lone silhouette cutting through the waves, her flight deck busy with preparations for another strike. Below, Japanese crews rushed to ready planes, unaware of the doom descending upon them. The American bombers tightened their formation, the lead pilots adjusting their altitude, waiting for the perfect moment to dive. Hearts pounded as the ocean spread beneath them, vast and glittering, then suddenly tilted upward as they rolled into their screaming descent. Sirens shrieked aboard Hiryu. Lookouts spotted the glints of sun on diving aircraft, the shriek of engines tearing through the air. Anti-aircraft gunners swiveled desperately, filling the sky with black puffs of fire, but the enemy was already upon them. At 5 p.m. the first bomb struck. One tore through the flight deck, detonating deep within the carrier's heart, igniting fuel and aircraft alike. A second crashed near the island structure, engulfing command posts in fire. Explosions ripped through her hangars, sending men and machines flying in a storm of steel and flame. The Hiryu shuddered violently, her proud form consumed in a firestorm. From above, American pilots watched the destruction unfold. Flames roared upward, licking at the heavens, while dense smoke rolled across the sea. Their radios crackled with clipped voices, some triumphant, others hushed with awe at the devastation below. For many of these young men, scarcely out of their teens, it was the defining moment of their lives. They had seen fear, death, and sacrifice, yet in this moment they also witnessed history pivot, an empire brought low not by sheer numbers, but by resolve, courage, and fate. Aboard Hiryu, chaos reigned. Men scrambled through smoke-filled corridors, carrying the wounded, fighting fires with desperate futility. Admiral Yamaguchi refused to abandon ship. When offered escape, he declined, choosing instead to remain with his crew, to share their fate as warriors. His decision embodied the spirit of Bushido, a devotion that both inspired and condemned thousands of his men. As night fell, Hiryu burned brightly against the darkening horizon, her flames visible for miles. The carrier that had once symbolized Japan's striking power was now a beacon of loss, her final blaze marking the twilight of the Empire's naval supremacy. By the next morning, she was gone. Hiryu, like her sisters Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, slipped beneath the waves, taking with her hundreds of sailors and the last hopes of Yamamoto's Midway gamble. 4 carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor, shapers of Japan's early victories, now lay silent on the ocean floor. In a single day, Japan had lost the heart of its striking arm, the very core of its naval air power. For the first time since the war began, the empire faced not expansion, but the cold specter of retreat. The night of June 4th bled into the early hours of June 5th, and the Pacific lay scarred by the fury of men and machines. Flames still smoldered on the horizon, where Japan's once proud carriers had burned themselves into history, their twisted hulks slowly surrendering to the sea. The cries of survivors drifted across the waves, mingling with the hiss of oil fires and the distant rumble of waves breaking against wreckage. It was a night both victorious and haunted. For the Americans, a triumph that seemed almost impossible to believe. For the Japanese, a disaster so sudden and complete that even seasoned warriors could scarcely comprehend it. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, far to the west aboard his flagship Yamato, received the grim reports one after another. First Akagi, then Kaga, then Soryu, and finally Hiryu, all gone. 4 of his fleet carriers, 4 instruments of empire, destroyed in a single day. He had envisioned Midway as a decisive blow that would end American resistance. Instead, it was Japan's own fleet that had been gutted. Yamamoto ordered the retreat, his plans for further assault abandoned. The great armada that had set out to dominate the Pacific now scattered, limping home across thousands of miles of ocean. Yet even in retreat, the cost was not finished. Japanese cruisers prowled the waters, desperate to rescue survivors, but equally committed to maintaining the secrecy of the fleet's position. Many sailors who had leapt from burning decks were left to the sea, their voices silenced as night claimed them. The Pacific became a grave swallowing men who only hours earlier had served upon the proudest ships of their navy. For the survivors who clung to life rafts, the horizon offered no hope, only the endless reach of water and the dim memory of fire. On the American side, the toll was heavy as well. The carrier Yorktown, a veteran of Coral Sea and Midway alike, succumbed days later, torpedoed by a lurking Japanese submarine, while salvage crews fought valiantly to save her. Destroyer Hammond, alongside her, was also torn apart, sinking with many of her crew. Hundreds of American airmen had perished in desperate attacks against impossible odds, their planes cut to pieces by Zeros or falling into the sea. For every victory celebrated, there was a family who would never see their son return. The victory was real, but it was not without grief. For those who survived Midway, the memories never faded. Pilots who dove through flak into walls of smoke would recall the terror of that descent for the rest of their lives. Sailors who fought fires in pitch-black corridors, choking on smoke, remembered the screams of trapped comrades. Even those who stood on Midway's battered airfields, watching the horizon erupt with fire, carried with them the image of men leaping from burning decks into the sea. War was not only about triumph and defeat, it was about the indelible scars it left on every soul who witnessed it. Yet, within that suffering, a truth emerged. Midway had altered the balance of the world. Japan's aura of invincibility was shattered. Never again would the Empire launch an offensive with such daring and confidence. Its fleet would fight on, bitterly and fiercely, but it would never regain the initiative lost in those 3 days of June. For the United States, Midway became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, courage, intelligence, and sacrifice could change the course of history. The sun rose over the Pacific on June 7, 1942, upon a world forever changed. The ocean, indifferent yet eternal, rolled over the graves of thousands of men and 4 of Japan's proudest carriers, their twisted hulls sinking silently into the deep. For days, oil slicks stained the waves, and fragments of aircraft drifted like ghosts across the water. The battle was finished, but its echoes stretched far beyond the horizon, shaping the destiny of nations and the lives of generations yet unborn. For Japan, Midway was a wound that could never heal. In the space of 72 hours, it had lost not only ships and men, but the very essence of its offensive power. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had been the instruments of Pearl Harbor, the hammer that had struck fear into America's heart. Their loss left the Empire weakened, its naval air arm crippled beyond repair. Skilled pilots, men trained from boyhood in the traditions of precision and discipline, were gone, consumed in flames, or swallowed by the sea. Unlike ships, they could not be replaced quickly. Each death drained Japan of experience, leaving the Empire to fight the long war ahead with younger, less seasoned airmen. The invincible Kido Butai, once the terror of oceans, existed no longer. For the United States, Midway was both vindication and warning. Vindication, that the sacrifices of Pearl Harbor had not been in vain, that America's wounded fleet could rise from ashes to strike back with devastating force. But also a warning that victory demanded blood, and more blood would yet be spilled. Midway had been won through intelligence, bravery, and luck, but the road to Tokyo was still long, winding through Guadalcanal, the Solomons, the Marianas, and Iwo Jima. For every cheer that rang out on the streets of America, mothers wept quietly in their kitchens, and wives stared at telegrams with trembling hands. Still, in the larger arc of history, Midway shone like a beacon. It was the moment when the impossible became possible, when a nation stunned by surprise attack only 6 months earlier found the strength to fight back. It proved that even against a seemingly unstoppable foe, the tide could turn with resolve and daring. Midway was not merely a battle of steel and fire. It was a testament to the fragile balance of fate, where minutes, decisions, and chance encounters determined the future of millions. And perhaps that is the true lesson of Midway, that history is not written solely by power or numbers, but by the choices of men in moments of crisis. Nagumo's hesitation, McCluskey's decision to follow a lone destroyer, the courage of dive bomber pilots who pressed their attack through flak and flames, all these moments converged to alter the course of the war. One cannot help but wonder how differently the world might look had a single decision, a single twist of chance played out another way. When the survivors of Midway grew old, they often spoke of the battle not in terms of triumph or defeat, but of memory, of the faces of comrades lost, of the deafening roar of engines, of the smell of burning oil. They remembered the sea itself, the vast, indifferent stage upon which their lives had been tested. And in their voices one could hear the deeper truth, that Midway was more than a naval engagement. It was a crucible of human spirit, a reminder of both the fragility and resilience of those who step into the storm of history. As the decades passed, the Pacific covered the scars of 1942, its surface calm, its waves endlessly rolling. But beneath that calm lie the bones of ships and men, silent witnesses to the clash that turned the tide of war. And so the story endures. June 1942, when Japan never expected to lose, and America, against all odds, sank all 4 of their carriers at Midway. It is not only a tale of strategy and firepower, but of destiny itself.